It is my honor and pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Mr. Ioan Allen is basically the man who's been there spearheading just about every groundbreaking innovation in cinema sound I am capable of naming. Among those that will be extremely familiar, I think, to all of you, many of you, Dolby Stereo, Dolby SR, Dolby Digital. He's been with Dolby Laboratories since 1969 and really has in large part been responsible for organization and development of all the major audio advancements emanating from the Dolby film program in that time. He has many accolades and wears many industry hats, domestically in the US as well as internationally all around the world. But one among many that I will cite was in 1989. Ioan and Ray Dolby were awarded Oscars for continuous contributions to motion picture sound through the research and development programs at Dolby Laboratories. Many of you will be aware also that the Dolby Atmos system has just been launched and is now, in fact, installed here in Singapore. First, Singapore's very own Our Boys to Men, our local feature film, and then a string of major international films will be showcased in the weeks to come in this revolutionary new cinema sound environment. It's my pleasure to welcome Ioan back to Singapore. And maybe I'll kick off just with a question, actually, that I've had on my mind for a little while. I know we've talked a bit. It's tempting for some of us, whichever part of the industry we work in, to think about all these innovations, all these advances in cinema sound technology that Dolby is doing, and therefore to conclude that the only types of films, the only types of features that can make good use of this sort of sound would be, effects-heavy types of blockbusters. I know in one of our brief conversations before this, you do not hold the view that that's all there is to it. Ioan, what is your view of what the potential, the opportunities, what the excitement is for filmmaking today, given where the industry stands with advances and state in sound technology?
The role of movie making and exhibition is to tell a story. And I think Dolby Atmos is trying to help tell the story. And it's tempting to think that Atmos belongs to loud films, the blockbuster, the film that's effects-laden. But in actual fact, like every audio pro improvement that we've developed over the years, it takes a few titles before it sinks in to realize that there's an overall benefit for every movie. And I'd say that the subtle benefits from Dolby Atmos relate to clarity and low distortion, which applies to a simple dialogue movie as much as it does to a Hobbit or a Star Trek. But it will take a few months for this to sink through to the filmmaker who realizes suddenly that, hey, this benefits my movie. It's not just the loud movie that another director is doing.
How do you and your colleagues at Dolby help to get that belief across to the filmmaking community without just promoting the technology?
It's not easy. I cast my memory back a long, long time to the original Star Wars in 1977, which was one of the first major films to be released in Dolby Stereo. And that was followed by Close Encounters and Superman, and we had a hard time getting off the image that Dolby related to that loud kind of science fiction movie. And it wasn't until we released a film called Days of Heaven, Terry Malick's second film, that was quiet and had fields of waving corn and subtle ambiences, that we got that message across. One of the problems we have, though, is not just in the titles, it relates to exhibition. That the tendency is, if we are associated with Dolby Atmos, with the big blockbuster movie, that is put into the big screen in terms of a complex, which is the one that will be equipped for Dolby Atmos. And the smaller movie, the more dialogue-driven movie, probably isn't in screen number 1. It's going to be in screen number 3, which is not going to be the first one that the exhibitor will convert to the Dolby Atmos capability. So I'm saying it's a slow process to get the catchment beyond just the obvious big, Hobbit type blockbuster Star Trek type movie.
Just from a quick visual scan of the people in the room, I believe not everyone here may be familiar with Dolby Atmos per se. So could you just briefly tell everyone about it?
If you look at the tradition of film formats over the years, obviously things started with mono years ago. And Dolby Stereo was a channel-based format that was introduced in the mid-1970s, which had left, center, right, and a mono surround track, hooked together all the surround speakers in a cinema. Then we move on towards formats like the original Dolby Digital format, which was 3 channels behind the screen, and a left surround channel, and a right surround channel. So by left surround channel, I mean that however many speakers there were on the left side wall and the left rear wall, they'd all be attached together, so it becomes one channel of sound. That moved on to Dolby Surround DX 6.1, 7.1, which had 4 surround zones, if you like, but it's still channel-based. And there's a limit to what you can do with a channel-based system. What Atmos does is introduces the concept of an object, which is a sound that can be sent to a single individual loudspeaker as required, and can also attach to a series of loudspeakers as a channel-based. But that ability to direct a single sound to a single loudspeaker means that the surrounds get totally new accuracy that was not possible before. I'll give you an example of a horror film, for instance, where a ticking clock can come from a single loudspeaker, has an impact that you can never achieve if you're firing up a row of loudspeakers. So it's that atmospheric ability that comes from Dolby Atmos that's step number 1. And step number 2 is that Atmos comes with ceiling loudspeakers, speakers in the roof, with 2 rows of single addressable loudspeakers in the ceiling. And you might say to yourself, well, not every movie has ceiling sounds that are needed to come from the ceiling. And you might think that's true, but in practice, if you think the benefit of having ceiling speakers extends far and beyond just a movie about helicopters or jungles, where there are obvious sounds coming from overhead. I thought of an example the other day, which is to make a crowd scene more claustrophobic, more frightening. Even though visually what you see is on the horizontal plane with people standing around you, let's say in a cocktail party, if you put a little bit of that soundtrack of people talking into the ceiling speakers so that the audience would never actually notice it consciously, just very subtly, means that the hemisphere of sound all around you increases that feeling of claustrophobia. So that Dolby Atmos can be used in ways that are not just apparent in terms of obvious sounds that come from overhead.
Does a decision to use the Dolby Atmos system for playout have a significant impact on the decisions that have to be made further upstream in pre-production and in the actual production process itself?
I always like, in the old days, we used to meet up with the director and the sound designer before things started. That is the most efficient way to do a soundtrack for a film. In fact, I've always believed in a thing called a sound storyboard, which is the second you finish the script, you actually script out the soundtrack, working out in advance what sound effects you would require. In practice, the economics of film making mean that this is a very rare occurrence that we get involved that early. And now the tendency is more and more just to get involved during the post-production process. But one of the attractions perhaps of Atmos is that because it is a new kind of sound system, that we will be back into that pre-planning stage, which actually can save a lot of money. A good example is Wild Track, which is a recording of the atmosphere on a location where the dialogue isn't, where the actors are not actually speaking. If you record more wild track, you will save money in post-production because it's not necessary to loop actors later on and artificially create that atmosphere. Pre-planning of the soundtrack says this is where I will need more atmosphere recording, and effects like that can be planned in advance, thus saving money in post-production. So let's hope we get more involved in pre-planning in the future, rather than just being brought in at the last minute. It's rather like designing a cinema. You know, the tendency, unfortunately, certainly in some theaters chains in the United States, is to get the interior designer in first, who designs what the theater will look like. And second, in comes the architect to try and implement what the interior designer wanted. And then thirdly, in comes the acoustician to try and fix the bad acoustics that have come from the previous two steps.
Well,
I hope that's not the case over here.
A landlord in my previous life, whom I should not name, wanted to give the exhibitor tenant a 2-week fit-out period on the grounds that that was exactly the same lead time the hypermarket in the building downstairs would have, and there was a not very long but very fervent explanation of why that would not work. Ioan, I have one question about where digital cinema is today and where it's going. When digital cinema was first taking off, I think the independent filmmaking community initially got very excited because they felt this would lower the barriers for them. It would lower the barriers for them in production, it would lower the barriers for them in exhibition, in distribution exhibition. And with one of the things that you alluded briefly to just now, the fact that as we were crossing over from 35mm to DCP, not all of the screens, not all of the auditoriums in multiplexes were necessarily digitally equipped. They tended to be, and still tend to be in some cases, the large halls, screen 1, screen 2. Consequently, the pressure, the squeeze that the independent filmmakers felt was even greater. What is the state of digital cinema today? And with what's happening in sound as well, how is that impacting that, and where do you see that going?
You know, my experience in the United States is that there is a certain danger that some theaters will close, screens will close, because they can never afford to put in digital cinema. And that the precedence for that is back in the 1930s in England, which is the country I was most familiar with. Not that I was around at the time. Even I wasn't around in 1930. But with the advent of sound coming into motion pictures, I think 20% of the screens in England closed because they could never afford to put in the sound equipment. And this is going to happen in the United States. Maybe not 20%, but some few thousand screens will close. Now, the impact on a multiplex equipping screen number 7 or screen number 10 is not that significant. The impact on the independent filmmaker is quite significant because he may not be able to find a screen for his movie. But the worst situation of all is for the remote rural community where there is a single screen in a small town where there will be no cinema left in that whole district. And that is a terrible indictment to the film industry that it allows that to happen, where a community will lose its only cinema. And I think we're going to see that over the next year, with the studios less and less prepared to issue VPNs or do a deal with those single screen theaters. Some theaters are answering back by having local fundraising efforts to see if a community themselves will pay to have the digital equipment, but others will certainly close. Now, the impact to repertory theaters and the independent filmmaker is quite significant, and that also applies to the need to do a day-and-date release. It's a very complicated situation, but I think it'll take 2 or 3 years for things to shake out to see what actually happens and what the long-term impact is. Because on the surface, the independent filmmaker says, hey, making a digital movie is really cheap. I don't have to buy film stock. But it's not that simple.
I've heard, in a different context, a view expressed, an observation, that in developed, leading, mature markets, like the US domestic theatrical market, this is the situation. In some other parts of the world, where the phase of 35 multiplex exhibition infrastructure development has not happened at the same pace or on the same scale. In markets outside the US, where now, because of digital cinema, they are leapfrogging, as it were, bypassing one complete era and going straight to digital, that they may feel the benefits and challenges combination in a different way. Coming from the US with your international experience, how do you feel about? I'm undecided about that view. I don't know if I agree with it or not.
That's a very interesting question, actually. I think it probably parallels other changes in distribution. It probably parallels day and date releases worldwide. There are some other issues that attach to your question. When earlier new technology was introduced by Dolby Stereo or Dolby Digital, the growth worldwide was quite slow. It would attach in the United States first, probably in Europe second, and Southeast Asia would be third and down the line. And those technologies were not adopted until they'd been proven in the technically more advanced communities first. But nowadays, with this kind of worldwide globalization of so many things, I think that pressure is on to do it quicker. And that means that as there is a growth in cinema attendance in the rest of the world, that maybe makes it easier to translate into digital than it would have been 30 years ago with the introduction of 35mm film and that expansion.
Okay. In preparation for the brief period we will have for questions and answers, there is a number to which you can send a text message, which is 8369519 on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. If you're using a Singapore-based mobile phone, you don't need the +65 prefix. Please start preparing that now, because we'll use, I think, the last couple of minutes for any questions you may have. What advice, Ioan, would you have for exhibitors, I think, in this part of the world and elsewhere, as we now sit or stand on the cusp of these latest developments? What advice would you have for them to optimize, I suppose, their path forward, given where we are now?
Buy Dolby Atmos. No, that's too simple.
Thank you. That was simple. What else?
I think the exhibitor should really take advantage of benefits that you have in the cinema that elevates the cinema beyond the home movie watching experience. You know, I am a movie fan. I believe in movie theaters. And I think it's really important that the exhibitor takes advantage of the fact that you can do a presentation that is way superior still to anything that happens in the home. I know if you read a home theater magazine, it will imply that the quality of presentation in a home theater is as good as the cinema. It's just not true. You know, cinema presentation in terms of picture quality, dynamic range of the picture, and the sound quality provides an immersive experience that the exhibitor should take advantage of to delineate going to the movies from watching a movie in the home. And it's our job as a technology company is to offer that capability to the movie owner so that he can be in the lead, be the engine that's pulling the train for the media. You know, in a discussion this morning, I was talking about the fact that 60, 90 days of the movie's release in the movie theater is what makes the movie successful when ultimately it goes for home release. But the obligation is on us and you, the theater owners, to make sure that the presentation in that 60 or 90 days is sufficiently taking advantage of what technology makes possible. And I'm not just talking about the sound, but also the picture in terms of theater design, like ensuring that the back walls of the theater are not painted white so that you maintain the contrast on the screen, making sure that little things like that the picture is in focus, that the seats are correctly designed to ensure that acoustically they behave well. All these things are in the arsenal of things that the theater owner should think about when building a new theater and when presenting in an existing theater.
I wholeheartedly agree with you about the unparalleled nature of presentation in the cinema environment. On behalf of everyone, join me please in thanking Mr. Ioan Allen. Thank you very much.